We're all here.
I'd like to call the May 16th, 2024 meeting of the Land Use Advisory, it says and Use Advisory Committee. Land Use Advisory Committee. To order. We do not have a quorum, so we're just going to skip the minutes and go right into the information items. So Todd, you're up.
Okay. Look at that, the presentation came up quick. Can you pass me that little remote?
Most exciting part.
That's on that. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm Todd Graham. I'm principal forecaster and economist with Met Council's research office. And I'd say the main project that I'm working on this year is major update of the local forecasts. So here we go. I'll start this presentation with some quick front matter. Items 1 and 2 on here are material I presented to you 1 year ago, so this will be a recap for you. Am I always the May presenter now? Every May?
We like to be predictable.
Flowers and
Yes.
forecasts.
Point is, number 1 and 2 are going to be just a brief recap. Then the middle part of this presentation will be a discussion of how we do local forecasts and the preliminary results that we published in January. And now internally we are starting on a sprint of work on subsequent model runs to work toward what we're going to call version 2 of the local forecasts. We should have that published in August. I'll touch on that. And then the final part of this presentation is discussion of how we roll this out, our interactions with local governments and other partners and the public. So jumping in, a recap or a review of why and how we forecast. The why is that Met Council is a planning agency and the regional planning is forward-looking, and any good plan needs to have some expectations about the future, about conditions related to our planning, and forecasts fills that role, expectations about the future. So these, the local forecast set that we put together is intended as most likely outcomes between now and 2040 or 50. Outcomes of where and when are growth expected and how much growth, and again, what is most likely to happen. We are talking about how the forecasts fits with the planning. We do benchmark our system plans against with these forecasts. So while the local forecasts per se do not prevent any specific city growing as fast as it wants to grow, still the systems and the services that we're providing could be limited. And the systems and the services are guided by the forecasts. So both we and the cities have incentive to try to align the expectations and get it right. Because we want the most likely outcome represented in the plans that we're putting together. And for our part, we're also willing to revise expectations and forecasts during the planning cycle. Probably dozens of times a year, cities ask us for some small or large forecast change, and we work through that with them. At the end of this presentation, I'll be talking more about how local forecasts and local plans work together, but I'll plant that theme now. The Met Council and the cities and the counties and MnDOT are all involved together in systems planning and infrastructure provision and services delivery. So we do have this practical objective that the regional and local planners are planning for the same future and working from the same numbers. Where do I point this?
We're having trouble last name too.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
There you
Okay, here we go. Yeah, the forecasting challenge is how do we know the future? So we're providing answers about the future through forecast models. Real world systems are being reduced in model space, computer programming, to just the key components and behaviors, and we work to quantify those. And so everything is being represented in systems of variables, equations, and accounting tables, with all of those fitting together to represent, trying to represent how a metro area develops. Here we go. So the systems at issue are complex. There's a lot of things happening. And dynamics are operating at multiple scales. And for that reason, we have multiple models that we operate. We don't just have one model, we have many models, and I'm just listing 3 of them here for expediency. We have, the 3 that I'm most involved in. We have a regional economic model that forecasts region-level economic activity and employment and migration flows and other macro-level 30 miles up view, macro level population activity. The second thing on here, we have a land use model, a local land use model for allocating the future land use, the future households, and the future employment to specific local places. And finally, our travel demand model receives the geographic distribution of jobs and people, and it predicts resulting network conditions. So in different contexts, all of these are called forecast models, and their results are called forecasts. The first forecast, again, is a macro level picture of the economy and population trends. The second is where specifically households and population and employment will locate. And the third forecast is addressing traffic loads and transit ridership on specific segments or routes of our transportation and transit networks. So last year I presented you this, our region total forecast, and this is a quick recap. We expect to gain 657,000 population and 320,000 households, and also employment expands. It expands quite a bit coming out of that big dip in economic activity that we had in 2020. We're sort of back to normal now, and now you'll see the employment sort of decelerate, but still grows. Importantly, all this stuff on screen, these are regional totals and regional averages, and we use the REMI system, Regional Economic Models Incorporated system, as our macro model. It doesn't include the local geographic distribution, and the logic here is that the industries and the households are making a succession of choices. The first choice is what region or metro to live in or site in and do business in. That's the first choice. And then where exactly to live or site the business, that's the second round of decision making. This slide is a reminder that we can drill down into the demographic components and details of this future population. We are forecasting population and workforce by age and race, and we're forecasting households by household size, and all of those have their own interesting stories. On this slide, we're seeing the ballooning of the senior population, the over 65 population, expected to grow by 400,000 people over 30 years. And meanwhile, the net growth of the under 65 population, the orange bars, expands by just 250,000. So it's not a matter of people moving here or not moving here. There's a historical rebalance in the age makeup, the age composition of the population, with first baby boomers and now Gen Xers advancing toward retirement.
We just won't die.
That's a good demographic joke. Easy chair.
Easy.
Okay, I went through that fast because it is a recap of what was presented last May. So shifting gears now, the region level trends and forecasts are where we start, and then the much bigger puzzle and maybe the question people want to argue about in the next year or two is the forecast process for distributing those regional totals to specific places. So if we're gaining 320,000 households and hundreds of thousands of jobs, where will those be cited and where will households choose to live? So to answer that, the last couple of years we've licensed and implemented the Urban Sim model. And we use the Urban Sim model to handle the projection of location choice behavior. That is how households and employing businesses choose where to site. And then a second thing is real estate supply. That is, where will the new housing and business sites show up? And these aren't exactly the same question, but of course they're related to one another. So the steps that we advance through include, at the beginning, much data assembly, and then quantitatively identifying the relationships that matter, working toward econometric formulas, which you could think of as like a recipe for what predictor factors, what variables lead to the outcomes you're interested in. Again, the outcomes being location choice behavior and new real estate supply. Those are the things that we're trying to predict. So once we have formulas estimated such that they can explain the recent behavior and trends and observed numbers, it's only then that we then extend the formulas into the future and start working on the future time series. So I wanted to say on this slide that one of the things that is the basis of our project is the observation that different market segments have observable patterns, distinct patterns, different patterns of how they choose where to live. And so considering a number of groups separately allows us to model and predict who goes where. I mentioned earlier that the fastest growing, well, the numerically fastest growing population group is seniors over 65. So that is one of the market segments we're trying to predict the behavior for. Probably one of the most important to predict for because it is a group that gains 400,000 people. Okay, the other thing going on this slide, since there are thousands of specific locations in the region, and thousands would be too many to deal with. Instead, we're representing each location as a bundle of characteristics, including what are the demographics of the neighborhood, what amenities are in the neighborhood, what's the existing housing makeup, what's the urban form look like, how fully developed or not developed is a neighborhood, which goes to how much more can you put there. Concentration of total jobs, both in the neighborhood and also nearby. Accessibility to destinations. Is a place centrally located or is it remote? And finally, we also relied on land values and real estate prices as predictors. Those actually tell us a lot about the desirability of a place. So with all these factors, we are predicting the probabilities of every household type's potential match with location characteristics. And then we're probabilistically assigning the outcome. Where do the 400,000 seniors go? Where do the 250,000 working age people go? And so on. Future household locations for each segment are then batch assigned according to the preferences and the probabilities, specifically what location and housing characteristics would attract them, And we do the same thing for employment. I will have an employment slide in here in a bit. Okay, the last aspect that I'm going to mention, the model also takes account of not just the neighborhood characteristics, but also the plans and the policies and the limitations that we have through local governments, through Met Council, through where we have deployed transit service and so on. So from local governments, the information we have are the allowed land uses, the allowed density ranges, and those determine the capacities of places. We have programmed this thing so that it will enforce limits like those. And from Met Council, from our agency, we have the 2050 wastewater service area, we have the high-frequency transit network, we have a plan for the future highways and arterials network, and calculations of the projected accessibility from any place in the region to every other place in the region, which we can then squash down to sort of a summary accessibility level. If you're in place X, can you get to jobs very quickly? Can you get to a lot of jobs very quickly? Yeah, accessibility. I went through that pretty fast. Preliminary local forecasts. We wrapped up the first phase of our work in December around the holidays. We vetted a set of forecasts with internal system planners, and in January we published a preliminary forecast set on the council website. It's this version 1 is actually modest compared to the product that'll come next. What we produced in January was just the city and township totals and just population, households, and employment. Later, we will have additional forecast products that split the metro into 2,500 sub-city zones. We've called those transportation analysis zones, but that comes later. We're not ready to. We're not far enough along to share that yet. And now I wanted you to see some results. The version 1 set of preliminary forecasts was shared with city planners and city managers in January. That's what I'll be showing you. This first slide is the year 2020 distribution of where households were located. And you know Minneapolis and St. Paul are in the middle there, the darkest shaded area. And then this is the 2050 preliminary forecast. And if we flip back and forth, you can see that the metro there is some growth in the middle. The metro is also growing outward. And you can see on this map that the number of households is growing. There's infill and intensification, but also that outward push and outward expansion of the second and third ring suburbs, what we call the developing edge. And here, this slide is the net difference, just subtraction, between the first 2 slides that I showed you. So this slide is showing growth. Yeah, the darkest areas are the areas with the most growth in households forecasted, and the very light yellow areas are areas with really no households growth. They tend to be rural or the airport. Yes, no households being added at the airport.
Give them time, they'll figure it out.
There's a reason, though. There's no households at the airport.
Jerry,
Go ahead.
Madam Chair, when you talk about the rural no growth, is that because there's lots of swamps? I know in Carver County there's lots of swamps, and you ain't gonna have growth there. Is that where you have your yellows in those areas there? Or I was just curious, you know.
Well, at the upper end of this map, Linwood is a very remote place. I mean, I think it's both forested and swampy. and a wildlife reserve, yes. But, you know, you get out into the edges of the region and many of these townships have been planned to be, let's say, permanently rural or permanently agricultural. So there's no plan, and it's not appropriate to be developing in some of those areas.
And the one down in the corner by Belle Plain in Scott County, a lot of that is future regional park. So anybody who existingly has a house on an acreage there, the goal is to buy all of those up for a big regional park next to the river.
Is that horse trail park that's down there? Is that the one you're talking about?
Blakely Bluffs Regional Park. It isn't open yet. They're just still working on getting the land.
Picking up this slide goes along with this next slide. I've taken the map, the distribution, and summarized it in some bullet points. We expect over the 30 years, the 3 decades, that 31% of the net growth is going to be in the communities that we called urban centers and urban communities. A larger amount of the growth is going to be in the suburban and suburban edge communities. 19% of the growth is going to be in the emerging suburban edge, which I usually describe as it was rural, it's becoming suburban edge, it's emerging. And then the smallest amount of growth is again in those rural and agricultural places. And only
Madam
only the
Chair,
smallest share.
If I may. Now, this is quite a change from last decade. Wasn't the urban core centers a higher percentage, or do you have that for the 10 to 20?
Let me think. It was in the high 30s, the share of growth that occurred in the urban centers and urban communities. I didn't put that comparison on this slide. I did put a comparison with what we forecasted 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we were only expecting 28% of the growth to go into urban centers and urban communities. But of course, it outpaced that. We had the decade that just ended was historic in the level of apartments and high-density housing that were created. Much of that did go into Minneapolis and other developed urban communities.
Yeah.
But we think it's slightly swinging the other way. The next 30 years might not be as urban centered as 2010 through 20 were.
Well, I can tell you, developers and trends are switching significantly, especially in the last 5 years.
Yeah, since the pandemic.
Yeah.
Dan, did you have something?
Yeah, I was thinking about this in terms of sort of the acreage involved. Certainly the urban centers and urban communities have a smaller amount of acreage than the surrounding kind of donut of the suburban edge and suburban communities. And so the percentage or the growth per acre, as you might say, is still fairly high in the urban and urban center areas because there's just not as much acres to fit that 31% into, versus when you're looking at the suburban all around that 41, 43%. You know, the growth per acre it's spread out more still because it's such a large area that that percent of the growth is going into. Does that sort of make sense?
I think that is what's expected to happen.
Bill?
If I may, so what kind of feedback did you get from cities and townships in January when you released this first round?
I think do I have that on a separate slide? Okay. Well, I'll jump to it now. We did have contact with about 30 cities and a number of those were just asking questions or checking in to say, this looks fine with us. And of the remaining cities, there were a number that asked for a forecast that would be a little bit lower. There were a number that indicated satisfaction or close enough to satisfaction. They thought the forecasts were reasonable. And then a third group that wanted forecasts to be higher. And in all of those cases, if we had a chance to discuss it, we asked for what leads them to that position and what evidence can they bring to it. And we learned a lot about our model by comparing it to what the cities were telling us. One thing that I'll get to on a subsequent slide is we had not fully caught up to all of the observed data, all of what's actually been built in the last couple of years. In recent years, this region's been adding 20,000 housing units per year. So we are doing that now in the current work sprint that we're on. We are identifying to the model, letting the model know, here are the places where growth actually has occurred all the way through calendar year 23, December 31 of 23.
So if I may, when you said 30 cities, a number I'd say overall, it sounds like your model must be pretty accurate or you would have been overwhelmed. How many total cities do you have? 7-county metro?
181.
Pardon?
Cities is 141, and then we have 40 townships.
Yes.
Okay.
141 cities and 40 townships.
181 communities, 7 counties. 188.
And
I
again-
don't know if that was a big number or a small number. We did do direct email to all of the cities so that they knew that this was a thing we're working on.
And again, there's a lot of data out there, 14 county, 50. This is 7 county, metro, Met Council.
Yep.
Growth, so, okay. And if I may, one other question sort of in front of this. When you do your forecast, now the state demographer puts out data and her numbers are not in line completely with yours, correct?
Right.
So who's more accurate?
I think our track record's pretty good. We can look at how accurate everyone's been. Yeah, we're willing to do that, but I didn't bring that as a slide today.
Okay.
I had started recounting that we didn't have the full observed development time series loaded into the model. And the implication, what that maybe caused in the model is for the model to think that what it was seeing in the past decade would be the kind of behavior it would expect in decades going forward. So I can think of a couple of specific cities that said we don't have room to add 500, I'm not gonna name the city, but they said we don't have room to add another 500 housing units. And I looked at what information we had for them and I pointed out, well, you added 700 in the past decade. You don't think you can add 500 more? And the answer that came back is, yeah, that was it. The land supply is gone now. We did a lot of development in the past decade. So we're needing to identify to the model that what was seen in the past decade isn't the way it's always going to be, that the land supply does progressively get absorbed and then you no longer have the space to keep adding at that rate. So that's one of the things that we're going to correct in the next phase, and hopefully certain cities will be happier with what comes out, because we certainly don't want to be telling them to grow more than is physically, scientifically possible.
Well, I've already heard from Lakeville that their major landowner in the area that is scheduled for growth has decided they're going to continue to farm. And so they have to find a different place to put the growth.
That happens too.
And Onley?
Yes.
Madam Chair.
Yes,
Thank you. Todd, I just got a question as far as, as population increases and we start getting more denser communities, are you looking at the affordability as far as any type of wage incomes or income levels overall, and as far as maybe the possible costs of what these future values might be? Man, it's, it's a real shot in the dark, but it's just curious.
Short answer is no. I don't think we have enough knowledge of those economics going into the future. We can say, looking backward, that real estate products have become more elaborate and amenity rich over the multiple decades. Housing just keeps getting nicer.
Yeah.
But I think what you're bringing up is there's probably a limit to that, and I'm not sure how we would project that. And so that's not one of the questions that's asked in these models or coming out of it.
Another question on this version 2. You were talking about how do you deal with some of the things that happened over the last 10 years as compared to what the next 10 years will be.
Right.
Is one of the things you look at sort of the existing density versus the regulatory allowable density on given areas or whatever, so that you can see if a particular area is developed pretty close to its allowable density, you can't allocate a lot more growth in those areas versus if there's a bigger differential between what's allowable and what's actually in that area. Is that sort of what part of that exercise? Or is that more sophisticated than you might go?
I think what we're doing is sophisticated, but a little bit different. The capacity of any given piece of the metro, the capacity is one of the predictor variables, and also it's also a limit. We can't put more housing than the plan, the land use plan says is allowable. Now, where we have gotten in depth and very detailed is looking at the parcel level. What parcels, there's 1 point something million land parcels in the region, and we're looking at what of those parcels seem to be fully developed and mature, and you wouldn't expect them to redevelop. A second group of parcels that we've categorized are undeveloped. Those could be whatever the planned land use allows. And the third middle group is, let's call them redevelopable parcels that are partially built, but are not so built that they couldn't be something else, that they couldn't be developed. And it's only the last two groups, the undeveloped and the redevelopable, that we're really considering as the places where additional numbers could go. So we're ruling out a lot of real estate as fully developed and mature, and it's at its teleological endpoint. It's going to remain what it is.
So it's just a matter of catching up, like in the city you were citing, where they had had 700 units within the last 5 years. Maybe the background data hasn't quite caught up, and so the initial look at it may have thought there was more capacity in that particular town.
Yes, because our time series did begin at 2010, and we're still informing the model of what has happened since 2010.
Right. That's always going to be a challenge. Thank you.
Okay. Last two sections of this slide. This is a timeline for the refresh of our local forecasts. I think this conveys we're still early in the process. Along with the forecast set that's on our public website, we've also shared internally the data sets with our system planners in transportation and wastewater capital planning and water supply analysis. We've asked them to take the preliminary forecast set, load it into the various analysis systems they use, and return to us what they find are areas of concern or anything that we need to know on the forecast modeling side about what was learned about wastewater system capacity or about loads and accessibility on a transportation network. So we're going,
Water availability in White Bear Lake area. Does it
that's-
include that?
that's something we haven't quite worked out because that seems to be like a judicial issue at this point more than, now if you want it to be a policy issue, I suppose that would be within the council's purview. But we're not sure yet.
Okay.
It's a question mark that we need to work through. But yes, all of those things are going to be, we're going to take the results that we get from our system planners and refresh the urban sim model this summer. We're working on that now. And we're progressing into the version 2 work. This slide is just a summary of how version 1 and version 2 are a little bit different from one another. We're going to be introducing new regional policies, if there are any, and we expect to have a next forecast set to show people late this summer. Have that on our website no later than August 14 or 15.
And if I may, what regional policies could possibly be added here?
I've got a couple that are listed here at the very end of this slide. We might be looking at do we rule out from development areas that are prime agricultural lands or significant ecological areas. Sheriff Wolf brought up the water supply shed issue, looking at those, I guess you would call it well sheds that cities use for groundwater, and figuring out are there well sheds that are overly taxing the groundwater supply so that we need to come up with a regional policy. But this is a very early discussion and outside of my expertise as well. We have work groups that are working on that.
Because if I may, that appears to be a local issue if you were blocking or a large farm acreage, prime farm's going to be out for the next 30. But you're saying it'd be a Met Council policy area, whether you do it region-wide, try to collect all the data.
Well, we talked about limiting growth by water supply 10 years ago and never got there. And it's still kind of in the mix of discussion, but it so far is not looking like it's gonna be a real bar in terms of cities planning for development. That's what I've seen. What do you think?
In the chair and committee members, in the preliminary information that we, when we were working with Todd, we asked, for example, the White Bear area to not have any additional growth allocated because we are unsure. So we can do things like that. That's what's in there right now. Whether or not that stays that way is one of those decisions that you will have to make.
And Member Drost was also asking about agricultural lands. If an area is intended for farming, it would be inappropriate for us to be forecasting there. And if the local government, usually a township, sometimes a city, disagrees with that, then at that point, I think there needs to be a discussion about how are they guiding the land and do we need to move that land into a different policy area. The policy areas that were presented to this group at the end of last year. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, presented this. Coming out of the first set of forecasts we released, we did receive comments from cities and have come up with something like a shopping list of the adjustments and corrections or improvements that we think we can do this spring and summer. So, this on screen are some of the things that we're putting time into, and that could be a little bit different in the coming model runs and the version 2 local forecast set. I think all of these are gonna be improvements. A lot of it is just updating certain information that we have more current now. Last part of this presentation is discussion of what we've been hearing from cities and going forward, how we're going to be interacting with cities. We are willing to listen and consider the alternative futures that local governments maybe have in mind, or their publics bring to us. And what comes out of our model, of course, is not the end of the story, because it is at the point that you're done modeling, you move the work into the policy realm, and we can override or replace model results if warranted, or if policy moves us to. So we have a schedule for this on screen. This is the schedule of when we would have opportunities for city governments or other stakeholders to have input into the process. The first line on this table was the comment period that we had in January and February. The next comment period will be the same as the public comment period for Imagine 2050. Starting mid-August and running through the first week of October, we would be taking comments from cities, but also any other stakeholder or any other member of the public that wants to comment. There will be subsequent opportunities for cities to weigh in and ask for adjustments. At the end of 2025, when we issue system statements, which are like an instruction set on how to do a comprehensive plan in the metro area. At that point, we can talk with the cities again about their local forecast for their city and town.
Bill has a question.
So are these forecasts out on the website? If I go on planning, I can see the preliminary at a city level
I
county?
just looked up Roseville just now.
Oh. I wasn't aware of the system forecast that's out there is the one from 10 years ago currently.
Yeah, I mean, we have a website page called metrocouncil.org/forecasts, and you will find both the current approved Thrive 2040 forecast and also a separate page that has the preliminary Imagine 2050 forecast.
Okay.
And just for everyone's convenience, that page also has some nifty little dynamic charts that'll allow you to look at the two side by side.
And if you go to the next slide, it's actually a link in the presentation, so if you do the online version of the presentation, you can just click on it and go straight there.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm out there often, but I'm on the original. Okay.
I guess I'll wrap up by saying we're never really done with this. There are multiple opportunities for adjustments to the forecasts, since the forecasts are this connection between what we expect in the future and how we're doing system planning and services deployment, and also how cities are doing their infrastructure, capital planning, and land use planning. So in the end, the objective is still that we and local governments are working from the same numbers. Madam Chair, I can take questions if there are more.
Any other questions?
If I may, Madam Chair, on jobs, what is the number you're using off? I know you're using ballpark 400,000 over 65. Is it 250,000? No, that's the working age.
Let me go back. This is maybe a little bit, this maybe got lost in translation. There, we have right now in last year, 2023, 1.75 million jobs, and that's basically back to the employment level we had in 2019. Because in 2020, we very suddenly lost 200,000 jobs very quickly, and it took a couple of years to build back to where we were in 2019. So let's say that 2023 is the starting point. We expect 320,000 jobs the next 27 years. Yes.
My only comment, AI and work from home, the whole world's changed and it's hard to figure out data. The Minneapolis has 4 office buildings for sale empty. Those course centers are different, so I'm just wondering how you model it.
Yes, the region totals come from the economic model that I discussed at the beginning. And probably the economic model has not fully absorbed what's going on with AI. So it's still working from old concepts of how an economy works and how many jobs are associated with what, with each million or billion-dollar gain in gross metro product. We do know that the jobs are not necessarily held by people who live in the same place where the jobs are. That's becoming a growing thing as well. So when we presented the regional forecast to the council last year, we did share that we expect there to be some amount of increase in, let's call it, Twin Cities jobs held by people not living here. And that a lot of that increase would not necessarily be more commuting, it would be jobs held by people who are checking in virtually through computer connections.
And likewise, would there be other area jobs held by people who do live in the Twin Cities?
Yes,
So it's
that's
kind of
right.
both, yeah.
Yes. So over time, it's not a perfect one-to-one alignment of the number of jobs and the number of people in the workforce. In fact, there are more jobs reported as being in the Twin Cities than there are people who are in the workforce and living in the Twin Cities. And that's historically been because of all of the commuting from the ring of adjacent counties. But going forward, it's not just that, it's also the remote work aspect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to the 60% draft plan review for the 2050 land use policy. Angela, is that you?
I am. You're stuck with me the rest of the meeting, guys. Lisa will pop in as necessary if we need to. So good afternoon, Chair and committee members. I'm here today to share with you the 60% draft of the land use objectives, policies, and actions. I just want to pause before I get into that, though, just to recognize the amount of work that this committee, small but mighty, have done over the last several years to get to where the policy writing is at right now. You guys started working on community designations, and you did that for an entire year. That work feeds into this. You talked through scenarios planning, you talked through the vision and the values and the goals. So you have touched probably all of the aspects of the planning document thus far. And so you've helped frame how we have thought about the policies. You've helped ask questions that provided clarity in conversations that came after your meetings with council members, the Community Development Committee, and others. And so I just wanted to set that foundation first. Like, you guys have really contributed a ton of work to where this is today. And you should know too that land use guides a lot of the other work that is happening in all of the other policy areas. All of us internally are collaborating with one another. We have a huge writing team, but teams like this also really make a big impact. So I just want to thank you for that. You've shown up consistently. I know that we haven't had a robust committee, and yet you have all been really committed to this work, and we just couldn't have developed this without you. So I just wanted to say thank you before we start. So today, you have seen most everything that we're talking about, that the content of what the 60% draft is was the attachment to the memo and not the presentation. So the content was posted last week, and so Monday, sorry. And so that is the content of what we're talking about. The rest of this is overview. Like I said, you've seen the majority of it. We are responding to some comments, so there are a few things that are new. But we will just start by grounding in the focus of what the 2050 policies are. We'll review general and substantive changes, walking through each objective just quickly. And I'll wrap up with what's planned for this summer, what's next for policy revisions, and the work that remains for this committee. There's still a lot of work to be done. And a lot of those pieces are really critical to the comprehensive planning process at the local level. And so we'll really need your help with that as well. Again, the focus for the land use policy is really a people-centered approach. Elevating the voices of underrepresented communities, valuing their feedback in equal measure, and considering the individual experience within the built form. The list of things on the slide there, from managing growth responsibly and respectfully, aligning need with opportunity, the community connections, natural systems, climate, equity, and economic well-being are all reflective of the objectives. And that has shifted in some ways from what Thrive was. It was really investment focused, public and private investment and public and private benefit in Thrive. And we're really thinking, like I said, about the individual and people and community within the built environment and how they move and how they meet their needs for housing and other things as well. And so trying to just refocus again on this is how we have approached the land use policy this round. We were here last month, and we have been very busy ever since. So the darker green boxes on the screen includes external stakeholders. The lighter green includes council member engagement. It doesn't include the American Indian Advisory Council, which also had 2 meetings during this time, but they didn't focus specifically only on land use, and so they didn't include them, but they're very important contributors. And we'll talk about that in the presentation that's coming up next when I talk about the equity chapter and some of the efforts that are happening in that realm. So we've had a ton of meetings, and we've also concluded the local government focus group that we convened just around land use, and we concluded the community leaders technical advisory group that brought back the community organization leads, the youth cohort, and the regional policy cohort leads to reflect back on, this is what we heard from you, is that right? Are you seeing that in the policy language? Did we get that right? So just circling back like good engagement practices should do. We were at the committee the whole last night, by the way, with a general update on all of this work as well. And we'll be at CDC on Monday with the 60% draft plan as well. As we were listening over the past month, we did do a lot of responding to comments in addition to all of the engagement that had happened thus far just in the last month. With the land use group and the technical advisory group, some of the other meetings that we've had as well, we heard a need for clear identification of who's responsible for what, council role or community role. Sometimes it's both. So we try to be very clear in labeling those throughout the content. We also heard very specifically about a need for all community types to be able to see themselves in the language, and that's urban, suburban and rural communities, but also community organizations like the American Indian Advisory Council. One of the first meetings that I had with them, one of the first things this really smart younger representative asked is like, so if I read this, if I open this, will I see myself in it? And from an Indigenous perspective, I had to really reflect, I'm not sure, let me think. Yes, I think so. Could we do better? Yeah, we should. And so through that, it really drives changes in that regard as well. Local governments, again, we're very uncertain about what requirements will result from new policies. It's very understandable. Local governments like certainty and like predictability, and I completely understand. And it's a new decade, a new planning document, and there will be changes. We really just try to build understanding of what that could mean and try to talk through any concerns. And of course, we will be providing technical resources, try to assure some of that back end stuff as well. Ultimately though, policy decisions haven't been solidified yet until the council actually adopts the plan. So we do have a little bit of order of operations, like I can't tell you what's required until we know what the policies are, that kind of stuff. So we're balancing some of that, trying to provide our best information as possible. And there's a large support for the connections between land use and transportation, in particular, support for the technical assistance and planning resources, especially financial, that we will be providing, and we've talked through some of that with our local government partners, and appreciation for that we understand that there's a need for ongoing discussions. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that plan for this summer will include as well, because like I said, we are not done. Big picture review, there were some very broad changes, introductory language, reorganization, consolidation. I think you'll remember some of our policy sections had like 12 different, like objectives had like 12 different policies. We slimmed that up. There's a lot of efficiencies that we tried to find. And we didn't lose a lot of the content, but we organized it so that it made sense, it wasn't repetitive, and that they were all, the common themes were within the same sections. Lots of consistency for our internal documents, terminology and things like that. We added links to resources where necessary. If we're referencing, say, a planning principle like universal design, we provide some background on what that is. That's context. We provided some statutory language that was somehow missing in there. So when we were thinking about aggregate resources, required statutory language in there, we added that in there. Last year, the legislature, as you know, adopted some additional climate planning requirements, and so we added that language in there. The same for historic preservation and access to solar, just making sure that that clear language is in there as well. There were some substantive changes. The density analysis that you all have been walking through over many months now with Raya Smiley, we formalized that into an actual report that's linked within the 60% document that you had attached to the meeting materials. The only difference in that report is that there are actually recommendations now as part of that. I'm proposing to bring that to our next meeting and really walk through those that density conversation in much more detail. We did add an approach to evaluate the feasibility of demand and development of land uses based on practicality as part of that density analysis. And that really just ensures both the intensity and the location of planned developments are practical. It sets up a reasonable and plausible framework for land use planning. So it's not necessarily pie in the sky kind of thing, but show your work. And like Todd was saying, when communities want additional higher forecasts or something like that, they ask for additional information. So the local governments know the community much more closely. They understand where building permits are happening, what kind of development's happening in the community, and we may ask for some similar information just to prevent the overestimation of development outcomes. So, a couple other substantive changes that I want to talk about. More than one housing type within a land use category. That language was in the housing section, housing objective initially. We moved that into the first objective just to consolidate that where it was most appropriate. Sorry, I'm glad it wasn't. That's so fun. So we're proposing that more than one housing type would be required in residential land use categories, and that density ranges for housing, those land use categories would be broad enough to allow for more than one housing type. We do have, it's not widespread, but we do have occurrences within the region where a community will have a land use category that has a density range of 2.2 to 2.5. And then the next density range is 7 to 17 or something like that. And so we just want to make sure there's a little bit of consistency with that, and that a single land use provides for more than one type of housing.
Why?
Well, we know that single-family residential is the broadest category of use across the region. It does take a lot of land to do that, and what we're trying to do is allow for that diversity of housing type within community so that there's an opportunity for a person to move throughout their life within a single community without having to leave the community. And so what we're seeing is that one use within a single land use category is really restricting that flexibility for housing type, and we're proposing that that this be added as a result.
Okay, because I mean, I don't really see that. I mean, Bill and I went and looked at his neighborhood, and they've got a bunch of different densities all within the same neighborhood, but they're separate, you know.
It's cluster housing all over, significant. So, yeah, 20 units an acre to 12 right next to each other.
And we do see a lot of communities are doing this already. I don't think this would be a huge widespread change. I think more than half communities already do that. They allow for many different housing types within a land use category. They get the more specific direction in their zoning ordinances. So when land use categories are capturing many different housing types, that's pretty normal. But we do have some that are like no only single family housing here, or no only duplexes here, and it's very, it segregates the types of housing uses within a community. That's what we're saying.
Okay, because
Just to clarify, so you're saying land use categories in the comp plan, not the zoning?
We don't
within
do
those.
zoning at the
Right, yeah,
Metropolitan
well,
Council.
right, yeah, exactly.
so you
And I
can,
like it that way if you want to know the truth.
so you can still zone a neighborhood single family. The comp plan is more flexible, but the neighborhood, because the reason that concerns me is because just north of my neighborhood, Lakeville experimented with twin homes and single family all mixed together, and they didn't do it anymore because it didn't go very well. Because if you only own half of your house and it's not an association, and the other half of your house just lets their roof go, so there's been a lot of problems with maintenance and property values and stuff because of challenges with bad property owners.
Just as an example, I think in our single family zone, or in our single family category, I'll say, we talk about that you can have single family homes, you can have what they call like courtyard homes, which are individual units, but they're spaced differently and they have different size lots. So there's a number of different things that category allows in our comp plan. And then, even our zoning, we've tried to be a little more flexible with the different zones to allow different things. But once again, what actually gets developed and what's already on the ground you know, that was the big concern everybody had when we allowed twin homes and some other things in our single-family zone, was, oh my gosh, the whole town is gonna turn into twin homes. Well, the reality is that, you know, change doesn't happen immediately because everybody's gonna pretty much stay where they are for the foreseeable future, except in those few areas where maybe there's a large lot where somebody subdivides, or, you know, or several homes are in a bad state of repair and somebody can buy them all up and do something. But the vast majority of our city is still staying very much single family, even though we made that change.
Well, and I don't have anything against twin homes, there's some really nice neighborhoods full of twin homes.
And that's one of the
But
categories, yeah.
Having an association to make sure that your neighbor has to replace their roof
Mhm.
is,
That's a big thing, yeah.
yeah.
And I'm just guessing if I looked at cities here, just about everything you approve's a PUD?
Nope.
Isn't?
Hardly
So
at all.
That's interesting, because just about everything I've been involved with, it's a PUD. Land cost and higher density and more mix gives you a lot of flexibility. But land use, I know it's generally it's higher than, in my view, the last, I'll say 5 years, especially with cost. Because you can't make it work.
So our experience, just very briefly with PUDs, was they were turning into a tool to avoid zoning requirements. And so we got rid of them in our code, and then we just tried to make our zoning much more flexible to try to give people those abilities, you know, so that you have more range of options. And we've only added them back in, but you have to have like a trade-off, you know,
Yeah.
where you're getting something for giving up
Yeah.
on. And you can only change certain zoning requirements, not anything you want to change, to put whatever you want wherever you want. So that's just how we've worked it, because yeah, it didn't make sense to have every development be a PUD. It didn't make for very regular and regulated development. So anyway.
Okay, sorry.
Oh,
I
that's
got us
fine.
off on a tangent.
That's okay, that's what we're here for. For additional context, we talked a little bit more about orderly annexation. We added support for the protection of long-term viability of growth and development of rural centers. We have had some recent conversations about orderly annexation agreements between cities and townships and how interim uses can impact the rural center's growth pattern. And so we're just adding the council's evaluation of the impact of interim uses where extension of long-term regional service might be under consideration and would ensure conformance with the regional system plans to avoid departures from those plans. So trying to address some more recent issues that we've heard about. Again, these are the 8 land use objectives, so I always like to land on have this in your pack so you can remember what the exact language is and refer back to it if you need to. I'm going to walk through the general changes by each of these objectives, just talking big picture. So we had a pretty good conversation about rolling land supply at one of our more recent meetings, and we added some additional context into the draft language to support a better understanding of what that might mean. We added support for Green Acres program. We already had support for ag preserves, so we wanted to add that in as well. Combined redevelopment context from housing objective, refined language from the density approaches discussion in the density analysis report. So with the finalization of that report, we just made sure that everything was consistent and that we were adding the appropriate discussion where necessary. Again, still in the 60% draft, referencing that the density approaches are still under consideration. These are the things that are under consideration. No policy decisions have been made, but this is the scope of the conversation. Just making that part of it clear. And adding context and support for development and land use stewardship that integrates natural systems in design and implementation. So just bringing in some of the natural systems content into the development side of the objective 1. Objective 2 is about transportation. We strengthen that acknowledgement of existing road system and the acknowledgement that personal vehicle use is going to obviously remain, but there are a lot of opportunities to connect uses in proximity to meet daily needs. And so we added some supportive language for residential growth, supportive commercial growth through a mix of uses and multiple travel choices, just trying to draw a more clear connection between some of the efforts in the transportation policy sections and the land use objective, and then added support for our vehicle dependent uses like industrial freight and warehousing around existing infrastructure availability, which I think makes sense. For objective 3, which for some reason I didn't caption what the short take on that one is. That one is about community well-being and welcoming through design, really. So strengthening concepts around connectivity through design, transportation, and community connections. Added context for, like I gave the example before, around universal design, which is design for all people, really trying to have an inclusive built environment without need for adaptation or separation to accommodate different uses. Integrated references from other objectives about green infrastructure, and clarified, added some context on what culturally expansive ordinances might mean in that historic preservation section. Objective 4, I turned the page too quick, just one second. There we go. We changed the language throughout the regional development guide in all of the policy areas. We're now referring to the protection, restoration, and enhancement of natural systems throughout, so we're just adding consistency of language there. There were some references moved to other objectives, like I mentioned already, just to consolidate language and reduce repetition. We did include water more explicitly within natural systems as well, and clarified council and community roles, particularly in this section, and the climate section too as well. Changed references from environmental justice to overburdened communities, again to match terminology in other sections of the regional development guide. In the housing objective, you'll see that there was a lot pared down from the housing section, and that's because we were really looking at working with our housing policy partners internally with the draft language that they're doing for the housing policy chapter, and looking at what really belongs in the housing policy plan and what really belongs in a land use housing objective, or housing and land use objective, however you want to say that. And there are things that were in some of the language before, referencing homelessness or the Metro HRA program, as well as some grant programs like the Livable Communities Grant. Those things really should be in the housing policy rather than the land use chapter. And so we were just cleaning things up in that regard. The content wasn't lost, it's just already in the housing chapter, so we don't need to repeat it. The land use objective then really focuses on housing within land use categories. We talked about that one other section when we were just speaking about the substantive change, and housing supportive land uses and diversity of housing types close to destinations. A lot of mix of housing types within neighborhoods kind of conversations. In objective 6, we added emphasis and some context around some of our equity language, just to focus on accountability through regular reporting, data maintenance, and things like that, dashboards and whatnot. We did add improvements to a procurement process to help remove barriers to engage with community organizations, which tend to be very small, limited capacity staff organizations, and sometimes a huge organization like the Metropolitan Council has some unwieldy processes. So just thinking about how our process improvements could help achieve better community engagement as well. In the climate objective number 7, I mentioned before we added some statutory references, so you'll see in that section the first policy there is really just all of the statutory language that was added in the last session of the legislature, and overall really just consolidating different themes together, avoiding repetition, and adding some context to different sections. There were some references moved from one objective to another in this area as well. More specifically for the climate stuff, we clarified some of the urban tree canopy intended purposes and aims, and included work on the emerald ash borer issue, as well as specificity on language around food systems policy, which is in that climate objective as well. I should wait till I cover objective 8 before I move to the next slide. Objective 8, we are updating as part of the regional development guide. We're setting the process for how we update the regional economic framework, which is a comprehensive economic development strategy that allows our regions, communities, and eligible participants to apply for federal funding. And so that plan was adopted in 2020, right at the height of the pandemic, and it requires a 5-year update. That full update won't be a part of the regional development guide, but we're setting the stage for that work. We're setting up the connection between that work that will happen next year and the regional development guide. So a lot more consistency and tie-ins between those two efforts, taking what the plan is already adopted and integrating some of those concepts into the regional development guide for now. And focusing on promotion of a just economy through both economic growth and well-being, as well as equitable access to economic resources.
If I may,
Bill?
Madam Chair. So explain to me well-being through equitable access and to the resources. What would be some examples there?
Let me get to the language. Committee member one. Okay. So let's see. Todd might actually help with this too. A just economy really gets at removing barriers to quality education, skill building, mentorship programs, training, job training programs. So a lot of the Objective 8 economic well-being initiatives are through partnership. There's not areas where we have regulatory authority or a lot of requirements, but the council has a lot of influence and a lot of existing partners. And by expanding some of our partnerships, we can try and help the regional competitiveness, which we addressed in Thrive. We talked about economic competitiveness in Thrive, but we can address some of that regional economic well-being for individuals through some of our policy language as well. Does that not help with the examples?
That clarifies it, but yeah, education and that is pretty much removed from that council responsibility, and subbing in Minneapolis schools, we haven't had good outcomes for a couple decades or more. So yeah, I would agree 100%,
But how do you actually do that? Yeah.
yeah, to be in here and to tie it, that's why
And
to the resources, schools, and decreasing population, we got a lot of issues in certain areas.
yes, and as we're looking at updates to the regional economic framework, we're looking at who we're partnering with on that too. The initial framework was adopted in partnership with Greater MSP and with the Center for Economic Inclusion. And so both of those partners were still, using the information and the partnership aspect to try and collaborate where we can to influence workforce development, to influence, even in other sections where we're talking about safe roads to school and coordinating with schools, we don't have any authority over the schools, and yet we have a transportation connection with that. And so in other ways, we can do the same thing with our economic well-being of people as part of our regional policy as well.
Okay.
Just trying to get at
Right.
better partnership.
Understand it much better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will just wrap up. We have more engagement planned for the summer months. This week, we set dates and, well, finalized dates, I should say, for 5 engagement workshops or presentations for the forecasting work that Todd presented on. 3 of those will be in person and 2 will be virtual. We're also working with Metro Cities to host 2 virtual workshops with local governments, specifically on density and land use, understanding that whenever we have density recommendations from the Metropolitan Council, that is a really big issue for local governments, and we really want to make sure that we're having those conversations and hear everyone and their concerns, what that might mean for their communities, where they might say like, well, I don't know if I'm that community designation because that's not a density that we can really plan for, and we can talk about that with local governments. We plan to do that with partnership with Metro Cities. We have a regional planning advisory group that's been established for almost 2 years now, and they're local planning staff, community development directors, and others that have been participating throughout the entire regional policy development, and we have a special meeting. They usually meet similar to LUAC, it's every other month, and in opposite months, by the way, from when you guys meet. And we're gonna have a special meeting for them to have that same conversation and have an opportunity for questions and digging into some of that work as well. I mentioned the American Indian Advisory Council. That advisory council will continue to meet through the summer, through July, and then we'll be working to prepare recommendations and present that to the Committee of the Whole in August sometime. Councilmember Wolf is helping to organize some rural community engagement. Luckily, it's at a pub, so it won't be, won't be too bad for a work event. I won't be partaking, just so you know.
Let me give you background on that.
Please.
So I met with some kind of informal leaders within the elected officials and township officials, to sit down and say, how can we get people to actually show up and not just sit there and stare at us, have some real input. And they said that they had meetings at this pub before that's got a separate room, and it's a good location, people feel comfortable there rather than, dragging them into a government building. And so we thought, okay, and I looked at what time would people be able to come and what day. And so this was not so that everybody can drink while they do the discussion, but to make it in a place where people were comfortable being, so they would show up and participate.
And we'll be doing that in partnership with our water resources folks to have that conversation there. We'll continue to meet with council members. We have an RDG, Regional Development Guide Council Member Working Group, and we work with them every other week as well as the standing committees and advisory committees like LUAC. Ongoing cross-divisional team coordination. There is so much cross-pollination of all of the policy areas. It's really great to see. It's also a lot of work, and so it's pretty intensive, and everybody is reading hundreds of pages of policy work at this point, so really trying to catch everything, as well as looking at the equity framework and environmental justice frameworks that the council has endorsed. There are next steps for land use policy. Some of that is iterative of what I just said for the equity framework, EJ framework, and some of those other things that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But really trying to continue to integrate upcoming and ongoing engagement that we are continuing to host. So with that, we'll be balancing those revisions. We know that there's a lot of difference of perspectives throughout the region, and so we do our best to find balance on what one group and another group may not agree on. There's potentially some area for agreement, and we try and focus on that. And we will, again, follow direction. The council has really been telling us to be bold to address regional racial disparities. It is one of the regional goals for this to be an equitable and inclusive region. That takes a lot of change in order to happen. And so we're really trying to center community voices in this policy development work and hoping that you'll see that in the language itself. I mentioned that there's still work for you to do, so thank you in advance. But I think that the upcoming tasks are interesting and really important. I mentioned at the next meeting, I'm proposing that we bring the density report back and have another conversation here about what the actual recommendations are. And we'll be working in the meantime too on density analysis for TOD areas, and we will be making recommendations for that here as well. The review of criteria, guidelines, and programs, for example, criteria for the MUSA expansion density approach that we were talking about, the performance-based flexibility programs. We really want to make that programmatic, and we'll need your guidance and suggestions on how we can offer flexibility and yet still meet regional density goals and regional density requirements as well. We'll be building out technical assistance and programs and planning resources, and that includes exploration of financial incentives for grant programs, as well as some other programs that we're thinking about for like small cities planning, where the council has the statutory authority now to offer small local governments, especially, well, I suppose any local government, we're targeting small cities that have limited capacity to actually just do the planning with them, and so they don't have to hire a consultant, and it's easier for us. We know that it'll be correct and presented in a way in which meets our needs for review, for consistency, conformance, and compatibility, and so we can offer to build programs like that and just do some local planning with those small cities. So we will be building out things like that as well, and we'd like to do that with you. The timeline, you'll see things happen kind of at rapid fire nowadays. At least it feels, maybe that's just what it feels like for me. I don't know. But on Monday, I mentioned earlier, we'll be at the CDC committee looking at the 60% plan. All of the 60% draft language is really meant so that there can be a preliminary release of the content as it is today for everyone, all the stakeholders and partners to review, give us early feedback in preparation for an approximate 90% draft by the time that we're hoping for an official public comment period to open in August. The public hearing is tentatively planned in September, the close of that public comment period in October, and ultimate adoption of Imagine 2050 in its entirety: transportation policy, housing policy, water policy, land use policy, parks policy, all the systems and policies that you can think of at once as a comprehensive regional plan in February, I believe, of 2025, early 2025. So that's a lot. We'll be back in here and talking about all of these things. Some of the longer term things, like the criteria, are things that we can continue to develop over time because they can live in administrative guidelines that don't have to be adopted as part of the policy plan, but in tools and resources like the local planning handbook and some of our training and educational programs like the Planet program that we've had ongoing over the years. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. If there's something I can't handle, Lisa's got about 1 more minute if she's available before she has to duck out. But happy to go over anything that you might have questions on.
Questions, comments? I'm sure you read this entire thing in detail and have lots of things to say. Jerry?
To me, one way I look at land use, it has so much to do with how the transportation plays a part in development. If you're gonna build here, but there's no good roads to it, nobody's gonna buy it, right? I mean,
Or they buy it and get stuck in traffic.
right, or something like that, you see. What I have in mind is, I believe the Met Council's involved. They're going to widen Highway 5 and County Road 41 west to Victoria. So if anybody driven that, that's a mess. And I don't drive it because it's a mess. So if I'm out and about at that time of the day, 7 isn't much better, but it's better. Won't that affect the land use then? Like Victoria, Victoria is booming, but wouldn't that open up more development, say, between Victoria and then Waconia? I mean, so my point is, trying to plan land use things, you have to almost look at how transportation plays into it. Now, I mean, light rail is there to move people around, but like in Carver County, the train only goes from here to downtown Minneapolis. It doesn't go around the suburbs where a lot of the jobs are. So people are still gonna have to drive cars. So when you're trying to plan land use, you have to, I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to say, but you have to take in the fact that transportation is a very big part of trying to predict what land use is going to be, especially like in 2050, what you're doing here. So when you do your job and stuff, do you ever think about how transportation plays into that or something?
Yeah, Chair and committee member, yeah, we really do, and we've been working pretty closely with our transportation planning folks. There's an entire transportation policy section to the RDG, the Regional Development Guide, and it gets into all of that that higher level planning of where roads and when different kinds of infrastructure, including the light rail and the transit infrastructure is being built, being planned. And what we're talking about with this is really focusing on the land use and the neighborhood level connections. So we're not talking about planning highways and the principal arterials and things like that, but we're really talking about the individual scale, whether you can walk within your community, within your neighborhood to a local park, whether you can ride your bike or whether you can use your skateboard or whatever kind of mode you would like to use, but that you have options on how to travel from one place to another. And so really thinking at the much more local level scale while we partner with our transportation planning folks to think about that region-wide system level structure as well.
And the counties and cities are doing that math all the time because they're largely the ones that end up paying for those bigger roads. It's not MnDOT or the feds that are paying for
Really?
a lot of those big road projects. It ends up being the counties
County pays for that.
and cities. Yeah, well, even like in Lakeville, there's 5 interchanges and they all had to be either constructed or reconstructed, and 40% of the cost of that was paid for by the city of Lakeville. These are interchanges on Interstate 35 with county roads. The city paid 40%, the county paid 35%, and the combined state and federal contribution was 25% on all of the construction of those 5 interchanges.
Yeah, but those are state roads.
Right, but the state wasn't,
That doesn't matter?
no, the state wasn't gonna pay for it and people were gonna die if they didn't build it, so they paid for it.
County, yes, it was county roads.
Lakeville has a significant debt load as a result, but you gotta do what you can to keep people safe.
Well, I haven't heard anything from Carver County about how they're gonna pay. It's like $200 million for 2 miles or something, it's absurd, but it's.
That's gotta
what
be
it is.
figured out before construction starts.
Yeah.
I can guarantee you they're working with Washington, St. Paul, and trying to cobble them together.
Well, I'm sure, I mean, they're always looking to get some free money, but, but
It's the way it is everywhere.
well, it is, really.
It's only money.
On a state road, counties have to supply funding
Yes,
to build or whatever.
and cities.
Unless it's in the state's plan to do it
Yeah.
anyway, that's
There are
where-
some places where they pay
And,
for all or most of
they
it,
have
but
no
especially in greater
money.
Minnesota.
Sorry, but the funded plan.
Yeah,
But isn't someone designated to us whether or not it's a state road or it's a county road or?
that doesn't necessarily mean that the appropriate entity is
True enough.
funding it.
Right, especially if the timing doesn't jive with what the
Yeah.
state or otherwise
You're right.
plans are, so.
That's true.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we had, definitely, there are interchanges that were done in our, that had to be sped up because we had to get it done and we had to find other funding for it, so, or provide some of the funding for it, so that
Yeah.
definitely does happen.
You're lucky you're a township.
You're right, I just, you know, I can't fathom why a county has to pay for anything on a state road or federal road. I mean, that's their
It
concern.
just is, and it's been that way for a long, long
Really?
time,
Oh,
yeah. Now at least they have sales tax to help with that, but
Right.
it used to be just property taxes that were paying for a lot of that.
Well, I know the county plows state roads, and there's a lot of people that don't like that, and they tell their commissioners, you know, why are you paying for that when you could spend the money on upgrading county roads? Well, we do it because it's good for our residents. Well, if
'Cause
you're
otherwise you
doing
might
it, then
be-
the state says, well, they're doing it, so we don't have to, you see.
Well, otherwise you might be waiting for a really long time for the state to get there, is what.
Yes.
They should, they need to fix their own roads, not, you know, I don't understand.
Are there any things in the actual policy that you guys have questions or concerns about?
I was gonna, just following up on the clarification of roles as it relates to water. I was trying to find examples of that and I wasn't finding them right offhand, but I also don't wanna necessarily put you on the spot, so maybe you could just follow up with us on that.
And we have a whole separate water policy.
Well, and I understand that, but I thought it was said in the presentation that that was also in the 60% here, that there was some effort to try to clarify that, so I just, if you can point that out.
I think one of the bigger, like maybe this is what Eric was talking about, is that in each of the policies and actions, there should be an identified city role or community or council role. And I don't think that was done initially. And so really just trying to focus and make sure that we're being clear. And I think some of the engagement that he had with his climate task force and he has a climate technical advisory group as well. And so they talk about those kinds of things as well. Is this really a city kind of requirement, or is this something that the council is encouraging or the council will provide? And I think that a lot of the climate and natural systems sections focus on how we're supporting local governments and the kinds of resources and technical assistance that might be necessary to develop, and the council will develop those things to support local governments, and I think that there's clarity added in that.
I just know sometimes, at least in the last go-around, there was some concern that the Met Council was somehow taking over water
Oh.
from
No,
authorities.
we've
So I know we worked
past
through
that.
all that, but there's still residue of that in people's minds as they go into this next round of planning. So I just wanted to understand more how that sort of shows up in here, so that if I hear those comments, I can kind of point people in the
Well,
right
and
place.
we've actually really improved our relationship with the city's water supply people. We took a sub-regional approach to how we were drafting the water supply plan, where they actually helped write it. We had meetings all throughout the region in smaller groups, and they helped write it, and they feel really good about it because they wrote it.
Right, that's the way to do it.
So, Madam Chair, where's the DNR in this loop?
they were involved in all of that
Okay.
too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
make sure they're mentioned,
Cause
because that's.
The
one of
Metropolitan-
Miles' wells.
the Metropolitan Area Water Supply Advisory Committee has the Department of Health, has the DNR, it has the PCA, agriculture, all the relevant people that have a hand in that are part of that, so they participate in drafting of the plan as well. Okay, ready to move on to equity?
Yes. So I wanted to bring an update on the equity chapter for the Regional Development Guide. I know that we haven't focused a ton on that, but I know that you have seen it in the language and reflected in the land use policy section. So I wanted to give an update of what we've shared most recently with the Committee of the Whole, council members, as we are thinking about the Regional Development Guide in total, so that you can understand where some of that language is really grounded. So for today, there are 5 different components of the equity chapter. Obviously, there's context and introduction, existing conditions, and things like that, but we've got several frameworks that are really the core of the equity chapter. The equity framework, the environmental justice framework, a community-centered engagement framework, anti-displacement framework, and I've mentioned the American Indian Advisory Council that is working on a land, water, and people commitment for the council itself. So I'm gonna operate many different things at the same time. So councilmember direction has been very explicit from the beginning when not only is equity a council goal, or sorry, a council value, but also a regional goal. And so equity should be at the center of all of our policy, as well as the process to create that policy, centering community voices, being bold, being ambitious. The council members are really supportive of positive change, and they've been very clear that council serves all people of this region, and we know that the region has some of the worst racial disparities in the nation, and so clearly we're not serving all people in this region in the same way. And so with an equity-centered approach, we're trying to address that through policy. I mentioned that equity is both a council value and a regional goal. This is the regional goal language that was endorsed, final language in January of 2024, of this year. I just should be succinct. And then we took all of this framework language, this entire presentation. We've got 20 minutes, but we spent 2 hours in talking with the Committee of the Whole on it, and they were very supportive of all of the efforts that you're seeing here summarized today. There is a definition, it's more of an equity statement in the equity framework, and it's because equity is really a process. It's not something that we say equity is just this thing, but it is a process that focus on action. So it centers the voices of marginalized people of all kinds. It understands the inequitable policies, practices, and cultures integral to the history of this region, this state, this country. And so really importantly, trying to reposition community as experts in their history, needs, solutions, and resources. And you'll see that in particular in the community-centered engagement framework. So we have 3 grounding concepts for the equity framework, regional equity framework: contextualized, community-centered, and reparative. Contextualized really just ensures that we're understanding the context of either the project, the people, the community, the neighborhood, the land of the area or issue that we're talking about on any given day. Community-centered means that we're actually working with community. We have tried over the years to do that, and at varying levels of success, sometimes dependent on an individual, and sometimes really failing, if you want a full acknowledgement. The council has had varying success at being really intentional about engagement. I think that we've done a good job throughout the development of this regional development guide, trying to elevate voices of underrepresented people You heard about the youth cohort, you heard about the regional policy cohort with the land use community organizations of the community or the community leaders technical advisory group. I throw out all of these kind of names of things that we've pulled together, and yet it represents real people that are experiencing many different things, whether it is an ability difference, or it is housing insecurity, or a different racial or political group. So working with American Indians, that's a political group, different than a racial group. Working with a lot of Black communities, Indigenous communities, and people of color throughout the entire process, really trying to center community voices and listening to what they have to say. It's not enough to talk with them, we actually have to do something with it. And reparative, really focusing on creating solutions. Sometimes that is repairing a relationship. We have government, as you know, has a long history of maybe not being the best at honoring treaties, or sorry, I got distracted a little bit. So it can be repairing relationships, or it can be repairing the environment, it can be repairing a neighborhood. Any kind of reparative action can be included in that, and we want to make sure that that's commensurate with the inequity that it started with. I'll talk first about the environmental justice framework, understanding that all of the subsequent frameworks, whether it's environmental justice, community-centered engagement, anti-displacement, or the American Indian Advisory Council, are all couched underneath that equity framework that I just went through. So you will see those three tenets, contextualized, community-centered, and reparative. You should not only visually, but you'll feel it in the language of those frameworks going forward. The council endorsed this definition for environmental justice. I forget exactly when, last year probably, and the right for all residents to live in a clean, safe environment that contributes to a healthy quality of life. We do have, like I said, they are grounded in the council's equity framework. We're really thinking about the efficacy of the council's projects, thinking about environmental justice as a necessary and explicit component of the council's work, and ensuring that we have shared environmental justice values, and focusing on overburdened communities in that work. So this is the environmental justice framework. That blue is a little washed out, so I apologize if you can't see that very well, but it is people-centered, data-driven decision-making, that's the context. Prioritized engagement with overburdened communities, that is community-centered, and community benefits beyond harm mitigation. The law often tells us to mitigate harm, and we're talking about community benefits beyond just that. Seeing the law as the minimum, and we can do better, and we should. The community-centered engagement framework, really thinking about many principles for engagement and how we have done this work in the past. We have a public participation plan, I believe is what's called, public engagement plan. I forget what acronym is supposed to be, but anyway, in Thrive we adopted a public engagement plan, and these were some of the principles for engagement. We have done, like I said, sometimes a good job and room for improvement with this. And so I think that the values still hold: equity, respect, transparency, relevance, accountability, collaboration, inclusion, and cultural competence. From Thrive into Imagine, we really want to shift to a more relational engagement approach. So centering these values of partnering as co-creators, we haven't always done that, and I don't have a lot of experience doing that either. We typically come, we have an agenda, we walk through an already established list of things that we need to talk about, and I need your opinion on just this one thing, not all of the other things that went into getting where we are right now, but really partnering as co-creators from the beginning, so early, and sharing that development of the agenda and understanding that maybe the end product, the outcome that we think might be starting the initiative might not be what community actually thinks should be the outcome. And so really committing to investing also in building community capacity to engage with different government structures. So like Councilmember Wolf was saying, it's often really uncomfortable for the community to come into a big government structure. It feels imposing and it feels uncomfortable. Not everyone is comfortable with government of any kind just due to their life experiences. And so how are we building community capacity to really know how and when to interject their opinions into any kind of government process? We did that. We've developed this curriculum through the Young Leaders Collaborative, and we carried that forward into the Regional Policy Land Use cohort to really focus on, okay, now that you understand what this planning process is, how can you carry this forward into future engagement with different government? Like, let's make sure that community knows that they can engage on a local comprehensive plan, and let's help them do that so that they're effective at doing that. Government structure won't change easily, so we do have to try and support community in how they need to and want to engage with government, and focusing on assets in community as well. Lots of practices, so I won't go through all of them. Some of these just talk about the kind of standards of engagement, what kind of approach. That's that co-creating as that one of those, it's called IAP2, International Association of Public Participation. So there's a lot of principles that go into that, but supporting engagement through research and through dedicating funding and budgeting, providing capacity and support. Talked about community, building community capacity, and really helping to guide decision-making and prioritizing engagement with overburdened communities, just to recognize the need for engagement that is inclusive of all communities. Anti-displacement, I know I'm whipping through because I know I'm cognizant of the time. Anti-displacement is really a new effort. It is an active process of centering and empowering communities to protect their home, access to resources, and sense of belonging from loss due to a council investment or policy. We kind of waded into the anti-displacement effort through the Blue Line Extension Project, and we partnered with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs to have an entire anti-displacement effort. There was a lot of community meetings, a lot of community saying what they needed from that process. And so that's it's always been a planning principle, something that we know about. Gentrification and displacement happens all the time. Some of it is to be expected. You will displace nature when you develop the land, right? So displacement happens at all different kinds, whether it's people, whether it is other resources as well. Key components, I won't go through each of these, but really preserving cultural connection, strengthening inclusiveness, really focusing on a justice-centered historical viewpoint of anti-displacement, and prioritizing, again, overburdened communities that are most likely to be impacted. This is the framework then. So the objective to increase the ability for residents to keep their housing, amenities, health, and sense of belonging in a neighborhood. This is a council-focused framework, and so really thinking about how council projects and council investments contribute to displacement. We've developed a risk assessment, and we would expect project work going forward to go through that assessment. Prioritizing projects that support community connection and anti-displacement in our grant programs, and providing best practices and resources through engagement and collaboration with overburdened communities. Thinking about how we can build anti-displacement strategies into our own work at the council. The last one I want to talk through is the land, water, and people commitments and the American Indian Advisory Council that is co-creating that work. I'll just talk a little bit. This process is very different. We started this process by inviting members of the American Indian community, both from tribal organizations as well as urban Indian organizations, so individuals, elders, young people, artists, broad swath from many different backgrounds in the American Indian community, thinking about how we could approach this differently. Of course, we went in thinking we know all the good things, and let's talk about a land acknowledgement. And they're like, we have had a terrible experience every time. People ask me to participate in these things all the time, and I have never seen a land acknowledgement actually result in any kind of action that changes our lives. And so we heard that, so it's not a land acknowledgement. It is, we're working on commitments that the council can make to community as it relates to the land, water, and people within this region. We started with an inside-outside circle, so we showed up and we had some broad topics. The first topic was land acknowledgement. What have your experiences been with that? We heard very clearly what that was. But we didn't have a PowerPoint presentation, we didn't have an agenda. We had a broad topic and a couple of broad questions, and they spoke, we listened, and we took notes. We changed our approach and our process after that. We listen first, and then they invite us in. And it's been, honestly, it's been such an honor to be allowed to be participating in these conversations. I have a Mexican background, so I'm not an American Indian background, and yet I'm taking my own journey through my Mexican American heritage. It is an entirely different kind of approach when you're listening to the individual experiences of people that are just asking to be recognized and listened to. It is such a smart conversation. They know what their community has suffered through and survived. It's very clear that land acknowledgements are for non-native people. They are here, they know that the land is theirs. This is Dakota land, and they are fully aware of that. So any work that we do on this is really for us. It's non-native people that really need this kind of education, that we are all on Dakota land. So thinking through all of that, it's just been such an honor to hear what their needs are. We've been talking through, I'll go through to the next slide. We've been talking through each of these different topic areas. So we did talk about Met Council roles and responsibilities. We did bring in senior level staff to talk through what is the regional parks and trails system, and then once they know what the council's areas of their role and responsibility of the council is, then again, we are sitting back, we are listening, they're telling us what they need. They need access to sacred sites. They need to be able to harvest medicines for the elders in their community. They need to be able to have ceremony in nature, and some of the nature most appropriate to the ceremonies are in regional parks. And so they are asking for what they need. They know, and they've been saying these things for a long time. They're waiting for someone to listen, and we're just going to have to do that this time. We've been talking, we had the water policy folks come at the last meeting. It was a really great conversation. We have community members that have from Prairie Island Indian community that have been involved in the Hastings wastewater treatment plant needed to be expanded. I'm not exactly sure what that project was, but we bought some land that has a lot of cultural assets and sacred areas on it. And so we did that without consultation, and so the community pressed back, and the council has changed their approach to that as a result. It shouldn't take a community to tell us, hang on, you didn't ask us about this, you didn't talk with us about this, and let it get to that point where we then have to come in and say, I'm so sorry, let's have the conversation now and readjust. It was such a great conversation. The general manager of environmental services, Lisa Thompson, was at that meeting, as well as our policy writing lead, one of them, Jen Kostrowski, and it was just a really great conversation. They're telling us again what they need to be heard, they need to be listened to. We have upcoming meetings about environmental justice, the transportation executive leadership is coming, our housing senior leadership is coming. We've asked Chair Zelli and Regional Administrator Ryan O'Connor to come and talk about organizational change and to actually review the recommendations of the Advisory Council before it goes to the Committee of the Whole, and we'll be doing that throughout the rest of the summer. And so with that, I know it's at time, there's a lot that I kind of threw at you, but that's the approaches that the council has endorsed, and those are the efforts and initiatives that the council, your communities can expect the council staff to come up and show up in the way that I've shared with you today. And so I just wanted to share that with you all as well, and I'm happy to take any questions and comments.
Just a real quick question. What's an overburdened community? Can you describe that?
It means many different things. So largely Black, Indigenous, and people of color, marginalized communities are those that have often been excluded from public process. And so in different spaces, it can include different communities. You have the aging community, you have people that have very low incomes, you have people that are housing insecure, you have people with disabilities. So marginalized communities encompass all of that and more.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Just a comment, I think this is light years ahead of where the Met Council has been in the past, and so I think you have to give credit to this organization and everybody in it for all this work in this area, because it is a huge shift for a lot of organizations and individuals to think differently about this. And so, I know in our own organization, we're still struggling with a lot of things in these areas. And so I've been taking notes, mental notes, and learning things too. So I just wanted to express appreciation for that council being very intentional about this. And as you noted, you do get a lot out of the interactions that are part of it, that even though you might be heading to a meeting, you might say, oh my gosh, another meeting, and then you come out of it quite inspired. So thank you.
Thank you so much, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I echo that. It's Wendy, Chair Wolf, you mentioned it, but when you're on other people's turf, you get completely different discussions than in the government side. And to go out without an agenda is risky, but it's the way you build trust and relationships. So good job.
Yeah. And I agree with what's been said as well. I think from the ground roots area is coming up, and they're telling us what they need and what they're looking for, and that's really important. So that helps us develop policy, and hopefully they become more interactive in getting on some of these committees, being more outspoken, and bringing those issues to light.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We are done with all of our business today, so the meeting is adjourned.
And thank you for the cookies.